The gleaming halls of the Interstellar Academic Consortium stretched like crystalline veins through a structure that defied traditional architectural understanding. Constructed from adaptive metamaterials that shifted and responded to environmental conditions, the building was a living testament to galactic scientific achievement. Jack Martinez stood at the entrance, a singular figure among a sea of alien diversity. His human form, muscular, bipedal, seemingly primitive by galactic standards, contrasted sharply with the surrounding students. To his left, a gaseous being from the methane clouds of Zephyria subtly pulsed and shimmered, its molecular structure maintaining cohesion through complex electromagnetic fields. To his right, a silicon-based life form from the crystal mountains of Crichton reflected light in mesmerizing prismatic patterns. Professor Liara, a crystalline entity whose body was a complex network of translucent, interconnected geometric shapes, observed the new arrival with intense curiosity. Her species had long studied the emerging human civilization, finding them simultaneously puzzling and fascinating. Humans were relatively new to the galactic stage, a young species that had barely begun to understand the complexity of interstellar relationships. The orientation hall was a marvel of technological integration. Holographic displays danced with intricate data streams, simultaneously translating communication for hundreds of different species. Linguistic algorithms worked in real time, converting complex biological signals, electromagnetic communications, and traditional sound-based languages into a unified understanding. Jack's arrival had been the subject of considerable discussion among the academic staff. Humans were a rare sight in advanced interstellar educational programs. Most believed their species was too young, too primitive to compete with the established scientific powerhouses of the galaxy. But the Martinez family had cultivated unique connections, securing this unprecedented opportunity through a combination of diplomatic negotiation and scientific recommendation. The young human carried minimal equipment, a simple environmental adaptation suit that looked almost archaic compared to the complex protective gear of other students. His datapad appeared standard, almost rudimentary, compared to the advanced Neuralink devices used by most galactic scholars. Yet there was something in his eyes, a combination of curiosity, intelligence, and an undefined quality that seemed to unsettle the more established academic residents. Professor Liara's crystalline form shifted subtly, her molecular structure expressing a complex range of emotions that would be invisible to less perceptive observers. Excitement, curiosity, and a hint of professional skepticism played across her prismatic body. Humans were known for their unpredictability, their capacity for unexpected adaptation. This student might prove to be more than just another academic experiment. The orientation process was anything but simple. Each student underwent a comprehensive assessment that went far beyond traditional educational screening. Biological compatibility, cognitive resonance, psychological adaptability, and fundamental learning potential were analyzed through a series of sophisticated quantum-level scans. As Jack moved through the initial screening stations, the scanning systems worked overtime. His biological readings presented a fascinating puzzle. Compared to most galactic species, human physiology seemed almost primitive, yet there was an underlying complexity that defied simple categorization. Adaptive markers in his genetic structure suggested an evolutionary history of constant challenge and rapid adaptation. The other students watched with a mixture of curiosity and reservation. Humans were still somewhat of an unknown quantity in advanced academic circles. Stories circulated about their remarkable ability to survive in conditions that would destroy most known species, but concrete scientific understanding remained limited. Jack seemed unperturbed by the attention. He moved with a quiet confidence, examining the complex environment around him with genuine scientific interest. Where other students might feel overwhelmed, he appeared fascinated. Each scanning station, each technological marvel, was an opportunity for understanding, for learning. Professor Liara decided she would personally monitor this human student's progress. There was something here, a potential that went beyond traditional academic expectations. Humans represented something new in the galactic scientific community, a species defined not by technological sophistication, but by an extraordinary capacity for adaptation and unexpected problem-solving. As the orientation concluded, Jack took his first official steps into the Interstellar Academic Consortium. Little did anyone realize how profoundly he would challenge their understanding of intelligence, survival, and scientific potential. The lecture hall was a marvel of technological engineering, designed to accommodate the diverse physiological needs of hundreds of different species. Adaptive surfaces shifted and reconfigured, creating optimal viewing and interaction spaces for beings with radically different sensory capabilities. Holographic projectors hummed with potential, ready to transform the space into any conceivable environment. Professor Krelvax, a senior instructor whose body resembled a complex network of bioluminescent tendrils, began the lecture on extreme environment survival. His form undulated with each movement, projection systems translating his complex biological communication into standard galactic language. Survival, he began, is not merely about endurance. It is about understanding the fundamental interactions between biological systems and environmental extremes. The holographic display erupted into a terrifying landscape of scientific challenge. Environments flickered into existence, each more impossible than the last. Atmospheric conditions that would crush molecular structures, radiation levels that could strip atoms from their molecular bonds, temperature ranges that spanned from the absolute zero of deep space to the plasma states of stellar cores. Most students recoiled. Delicate protective suits began automatic calibration, defensive systems engaging at the mere suggestion of such hostile environments. Sophisticated biosensors ran rapid diagnostics, calculating survival probabilities that measured in fractions of seconds. Jack observed with a different perspective. Where others saw terror, he saw a complex scientific puzzle. His environmental suit, seemingly simple compared to the advanced gear around him, appeared almost primitive. Yet there was a deliberate simplicity to its design that suggested something more. The first demonstration focused on atmospheric composition. The hologram transformed, revealing an environment composed of reactive chemical compounds that would dissolve most known biological structures in milliseconds. Protective barriers shimmered into existence, creating microscopic zones of safety for the students. Krelvax tendrils moved with precise scientific demonstration. Survival requires more than protection, he explained. It demands a fundamental understanding of molecular interaction, of the complex dance between environmental conditions and biological adaptation. Jack's classmates looked terrified. A crystalline student from the high-pressure worlds of the Centauri clusters seemed to fracture slightly at the edges, her molecular structure showing signs of stress from the mere simulation. A gaseous being from the methane clouds of the outer rim began to compress, its form losing cohesion. The human remained calm. The professor continued the lecture, breaking down the scientific principles behind extreme environment survival. Each slide revealed layers of complexity that pushed the boundaries of biological understanding. Quantum-level interactions, molecular restructuring, adaptive biochemical responses. The lecture was as much a masterclass in advanced physics as it was a survival course. Jack's datapad captured every detail, his fingers moving with a speed and precision that caught the attention of several nearby students. Where they saw horror, he saw opportunity. Each impossible scenario was a challenge to be understood, not feared. The key to survival, Professor Krelvax explained, is not about resisting environmental conditions. It is about understanding how to integrate, how to adapt, how to become part of the environment itself. The holographic display shifted again. Gravitational fields began to warp, creating zones where fundamental physical laws seemed to bend and twist. Molecular structures that would typically collapse under impossible pressures became a living demonstration of scientific possibility. Most students' protective systems began to show stress indicators. Warning signals erupted across the lecture hall, a cacophony of technological panic. Adaptive suits struggled to compensate for the rapidly changing environmental conditions. Jack made a simple adjustment to his suit, a nearly imperceptible movement that spoke volumes to those watching carefully. Professor Krelvax paused, his bioluminescent tendrils shifting in a pattern that suggested intense curiosity. Something about the human student was different. Where others saw an impossible challenge, this young scholar saw a complex scientific opportunity. Survival, the professor said, looking directly at Jack, is an art form of scientific understanding. The lecture hall held its collective breath. The impossible curriculum had been revealed, and nothing would be the same again. The laboratory chamber materialized around the students like a living nightmare. Transparent walls pulsed with an unsettling organic quality, revealing layers of complex chemical interactions that defied conventional understanding. Molecular structures danced and shifted, creating an environment of constant, terrifying change. Professor Krelvax's voice resonated through specialized communication channels. This simulation represents the most complex chemical environment ever created for academic study. Survival here is not about resistance, but about understanding. Jack studied the chamber with a calm that unnerved his fellow students. Where they saw an impossible chemical hellscape, he perceived the intricate puzzle of molecular interactions. His environmental suit, a marvel of human engineering that looked deceptively simple, began to run complex analytical protocols. The first wave of chemical compounds entered the chamber. Reactive elements that would typically dissolve most known biological structures within milliseconds began their destructive dance. Most students' protective gear flickered with warning systems, defensive shields struggling to maintain integrity. A student from the silicon-based ecosystems of the Crichton Mountains began to show immediate signs of molecular stress. Her crystalline structure vibrated with increasing instability, protective systems working overtime to prevent complete molecular breakdown. Nearby, a gaseous being from the methane clouds of the outer rim began to compress, its form losing cohesion under the intense chemical assault. Jack moved differently. Each step seemed calculated, precise. He wasn't just surviving, he was studying. His handheld device captured molecular interaction data at a rate that impressed even the most advanced scientific instruments in the chamber. The chemical environment became increasingly complex. Compounds that should have been theoretically impossible began to form and interact. Molecular bonds twisted and reformed in patterns that challenged fundamental understanding of chemical physics. What should have been a death sentence became a living laboratory of scientific marvel. Professor Krelvax's tendrils shifted with intense curiosity. The human student moved through the environment with a grace that defied explanation. Where other students fought for survival, Jack seemed to be in conversation with the very molecular structures around him. "Observe," the professor announced to the remaining students, "how survival is not about fighting the environment, but understanding its fundamental nature." Jack's environmental suit began to show an extraordinary capability. Rather than simply protecting, it seemed to be adapting. Microscopic systems integrated with the surrounding chemical environment, creating a dynamic interface that was more symbiotic than defensive. The other students watched in stunned silence. Their advanced protective gear, technological marvels that represented centuries of scientific development, struggled and flickered. Jack's seemingly simple suit moved through the chemical nightmare as if it were nothing more than a gentle breeze. Data streams erupted from his monitoring device. Complex algorithms translated the chemical interactions into readable patterns, revealing layers of scientific understanding that most researchers would spend entire careers trying to comprehend. A particularly volatile chemical reaction began to build. Most students' protective systems went into complete lockdown, creating isolated bubbles of safety. Jack, by contrast, adjusted something on his suit with the casual precision of someone making a minor environmental correction. The chemical environment reached a critical point. Molecular interactions that should have created total destruction instead began to form complex, almost beautiful patterns. Jack's suit seemed to breathe with the environment, moving in perfect synchronization with the molecular dance around him. Professor Krelvax could no longer contain his scientific curiosity. "Extraordinary," he muttered, his bioluminescent tendrils shifting in patterns of pure academic excitement. "Absolutely extraordinary." As the simulation reached its peak, most students were fully enclosed in their protective systems, reduced to passive observers. Jack continued to collect data, move, interact. He wasn't just surviving. He was learning, understanding, becoming part of the environment itself. The chamber began to stabilize. Molecular structures slowly returned to more predictable interactions. Jack's suit began a comprehensive data compilation, transforming the near-impossible survival scenario into a wealth of scientific information. When the simulation ended, the other students emerged shaken, their protective systems barely functional. Jack stepped forward, his environmental suit showing minimal signs of stress, his eyes bright with the excitement of scientific discovery. The Chemical Nightmare Challenge had become something else entirely, a window into a fundamentally different approach to survival, to understanding, to science itself. The gravitational challenge chamber represented the pinnacle of scientific engineering. Walls constructed from adaptive metamaterials shimmered with potential, ready to generate gravitational fields that would challenge the fundamental understanding of physical existence. Most students approached the chamber with a mixture of scientific curiosity and profound terror. Professor Krelvax's introduction set the stage for what would become the most challenging test of the academic year. Gravity, he explained, is not merely a force of attraction. It is the fundamental language of physical interaction, a complex dialogue between matter and spacetime. The chamber began its transformation. Gravitational fields started to fluctuate, creating zones where physical laws seemed to bend and twist like malleable glass. Molecular structures that would typically maintain stable configurations began to warp, compress, and expand in ways that defied conventional understanding. Most of Jack's classmates immediately activated their most advanced protective systems. A crystalline student from the high-gravity worlds of the Centauri cluster began to fracture at the edges, her molecular structure struggling to maintain cohesion. A gaseous being from the methane clouds of the outer rim compressed involuntarily, fighting against the changing gravitational stresses. Jack observed the changes with a different perspective. Where others saw a threat, he perceived a complex scientific puzzle waiting to be solved. The first gravitational wave hit with devastating precision. Zones of impossible gravitational stress created environments where molecular bonds would typically collapse. Protective suits from the most advanced galactic civilizations began to show immediate stress indicators. Warning systems erupted in a cacophony of technological panic. Jack's movements became a study in scientific grace. He seemed to read the gravitational fields like a complex but familiar language, adjusting his positioning with an almost intuitive understanding. His environmental suit, which looked deceptively simple compared to the advanced gear around him, began to run complex analytical protocols. Professor Krelvax's bioluminescent tendrils shifted with intense curiosity. The human student moved differently from anything the professor had ever witnessed. Where other students fought against the gravitational forces, Jack appeared to be in conversation with them. The chamber reached critical gravitational complexity. Zones of extreme low and high pressure alternated with mathematical precision designed to test the absolute limits of biological adaptation. Molecular structures that would typically disintegrate under such conditions began to behave in unexpected ways. Jack's handheld device captured data at a rate that impressed even the most advanced scientific instruments in the chamber. Each gravitational shift became an opportunity for understanding, for learning. His suit seemed to adapt in real time, creating a dynamic interface with the changing gravitational environment. "Observe," Professor Krelvax announced to the remaining students, "how survival is not about fighting environmental conditions, but understanding their fundamental nature." The gravitational stress reached levels that should have been impossible to survive. Most students were now completely enclosed in their protective systems, reduced to passive observers. Jack continued to move, to collect data, to interact with the environment in ways that challenged fundamental scientific understanding. A particularly complex gravitational interaction began to build. Molecular structures twisted and reformed in patterns that defied conventional physics. Jack adjusted something on his suit with the casual precision of someone making a minor environmental correction. The other students watched in stunned silence. Their advanced protective gear, technological marvels that represented centuries of scientific development, struggled and flickered. Jack's seemingly simple suit moved through the gravitational nightmare as if it were nothing more than a gentle breeze. When the simulation reached its peak, most students emerged shaken, their protective systems barely functional. Jack stepped forward, his environmental suit showing minimal signs of stress, his eyes bright with the excitement of scientific discovery. Professor Krelvax could no longer contain his scientific curiosity. "Extraordinary," he muttered, his tendrils shifting in patterns of pure academic excitement. "Absolutely extraordinary." The gravitational stress experiment had become something else entirely, a window into a fundamentally different approach to survival, to understanding, to science itself. Jack had not just survived, he had transformed the very concept of biological adaptation. As the chamber began to stabilize, the true significance of what had just occurred began to sink in. This was more than a survival test. This was a profound demonstration of human potential, of the capacity to understand and adapt to the most extreme conditions imaginable. The thermal shock chamber represented the ultimate test of biological endurance. Adaptive walls constructed from quantum-responsive metamaterials began to pulse with an otherworldly energy, preparing to generate temperature ranges that would challenge the fundamental understanding of biological survival. Professor Krelvax's introduction carried a note of academic anticipation. Temperature, he explained to the assembled students, is more than a simple measurement. It is the fundamental vibration of molecular existence, a complex dance of energy and matter. The chamber awakened like a living organism. Thermal gradients began to form, zones that shifted between temperatures that would freeze atoms solid and others that would transform matter into plasma states. Most students' protective systems immediately began complex calibration protocols, defensive mechanisms engaging with increasing urgency. Jack stood differently from his classmates. Where they saw an impossible challenge, he perceived a scientific puzzle waiting to be unraveled. The first thermal wave hit with unprecedented intensity. Temperatures plummeted to near absolute zero, a state where molecular motion nearly ceases. Most protective suits began to show immediate stress indicators. A crystalline student from the high-temperature worlds of the outer nebula began to crack, her molecular structure struggling to maintain cohesion. A gaseous being from the methane clouds compressed involuntarily, its form becoming increasingly unstable as thermal energies fluctuated wildly. Protective systems from the most advanced galactic civilizations flickered and struggled, warning signals erupting in a cacophony of technological panic. Jack's environmental suit, which looked deceptively simple compared to the advanced gear surrounding him, began to run complex analytical protocols. His movements were deliberate, almost choreographed. Where other students fought against the thermal extremes, he seemed to be in a delicate conversation with the energy surrounding him. Professor Krelvax's bioluminescent tendrils shifted with intense curiosity. The human student moved with a grace that defied conventional understanding of thermal survival. Each temperature shift became an opportunity for observation, for learning. The chamber reached its most critical thermal complexity. Zones of extreme cold alternated with plasma-level heat with mathematical precision. Molecular structures that would typically disintegrate under such conditions began to behave in unexpected ways. Jack's handheld device captured data at a rate that impressed even the most advanced scientific instruments. "Observe," Professor Krelvax announced, "how survival transcends mere protection. It is about understanding the fundamental interactions of energy and matter." The thermal shock reached levels that should have been impossible to survive. Most students were now completely enclosed in their protective systems, reduced to passive observers. Jack continued to move, to collect data, to interact with the environment in ways that challenged fundamental scientific understanding. His suit seemed to breathe with the changing thermal environment. Microscopic adaptive systems responded to each temperature shift with an almost organic precision. Where traditional protective gear tried to resist the thermal extremes, Jack's suit appeared to integrate with them, finding a dynamic balance that spoke to a fundamentally different approach to survival. The other students watched in stunned silence. Their advanced protective gear, technological marvels that represented centuries of scientific development, struggled and flickered. Jack's seemingly simple suit moved through the thermal nightmare as if it were nothing more than a gentle atmospheric change. A particularly complex thermal interaction began to build. Molecular structures twisted and reformed in patterns that defied conventional physics. Jack adjusted something on his suit with the casual precision of someone making a minor environmental correction. When the simulation reached its peak, most students emerged shaken, their protective systems barely functional. Jack stepped forward, his environmental suit showing minimal signs of stress, his eyes bright with the excitement of scientific discovery. Professor Krelvax could no longer contain his scientific curiosity. "Extraordinary," he muttered, his tendrils shifting in patterns of pure academic excitement. "Absolutely extraordinary." The thermal shock experiment had become something else entirely, a window into a fundamentally different approach to survival, to understanding, to science itself. Jack had not just survived, he had transformed the very concept of biological adaptation. As the chamber began to stabilize, the true significance of what had just occurred began to sink in. This was more than a survival test. This was a profound demonstration of human potential, of the capacity to understand and adapt to the most extreme conditions imaginable. The lecture hall buzzed with a mixture of confusion, excitement, and scientific wonder. Jack had done more than survive. He had revealed something fundamental about the nature of biological adaptation, a lesson that would reshape understanding across the galactic scientific community. The research laboratory buzzed with an electric anticipation. Delicate holographic interfaces flickered to life, capturing every microscopic detail of Jack's previous survival challenges. Senior researchers from across the Galactic Academic Consortium had gathered, their diverse physiological forms creating a living tapestry of scientific diversity. Professor Krelvax guided Jack to the central analysis chamber, a space designed to probe the deepest mysteries of biological adaptation. Translucent walls shimmered with adaptive quantum displays, ready to dissect every aspect of human survival capabilities. "Tell me," the professor began, his bioluminescent tendrils moving with precise scientific curiosity, "how does a species from a single planetary ecosystem develop such extraordinary adaptive capabilities?" Jack's response was both simple and profound. He spoke of Earth, not as a conquered world, but as a dynamic, constantly changing environment that demanded continuous adaptation. Mountains that shifted through geological epochs, climates that transformed with ruthless precision, ecosystems that balanced on the knife's edge of survival. The holographic displays began to reconstruct Jack's evolutionary history. Generations of humans adapting to ice ages, desert expansions, tropical transformations. Each environmental challenge became a catalyst for biological innovation. Where other species might have perished, humans found a way to understand, to adapt, to survive. Senior researchers from across the galaxy leaned forward. A crystalline researcher from the stable environments of the Crichton star system found the concept almost incomprehensible. Adaptation was not just a biological process for humans, it was a fundamental approach to existence. Jack demonstrated the sophisticated data collection from his environmental suit. What appeared to be a simple protective layer was actually a complex biological interface system. Microscopic adaptive mechanisms responded to environmental changes with a speed and precision that challenged fundamental understanding of biological engineering. Survival is not about resistance, Jack explained, echoing his earlier demonstrations. It's about understanding. Every challenge is an opportunity to learn, to grow, to integrate. The research team began to compile their findings. Jack's suit was more than protective gear. It was an extension of human scientific understanding. Adaptive systems that could read and respond to molecular-level environmental changes, creating a dynamic interface that was almost symbiotic. Professor Krelvak's tendrils shifted in patterns of intense scientific excitement. Humans represented something entirely new in the galactic scientific community. Not the most technologically advanced species, not the strongest, not the most numerous, but perhaps the most adaptable. Holographic reconstructions showed Jack's performance across multiple extreme environment challenges. Chemical nightmares that would dissolve most known biological structures. Gravitational fields that should crush molecular bonds. Thermal ranges that defied conventional understanding of biological survival. In each scenario, Jack had not just survived, he had learned. He had collected data. He had transformed the very concept of survival. The senior researchers began to debate the implications. A gaseous researcher from the methane clouds of the Outer Rim proposed radical new theories of biological adaptation. A silicon-based life form from the crystalline world suggested that human approach to survival represented a fundamental shift in understanding ecological interaction. Jack remained calm, almost humble. To him, this was not about proving superiority. This was about understanding, about learning, about seeing every challenge as an opportunity for growth. Our greatest strength, he explained, is not our technology. It is our ability to observe, to understand, to adapt. We don't conquer environments. We become part of them. The research chamber fell silent. The implications were staggering. Humans were not just another species in the galactic ecosystem. They were something entirely different, a dynamic, adaptive system that could transform challenge into opportunity. Professor Krelvak made a decision that would reshape academic understanding across multiple star systems. Jack would not just be a student. He would be a bridge, a living demonstration of a fundamentally different approach to survival, to science, to existence itself. As the holographic displays continued to dance with complex data streams, one thing became clear. The human had done more than survive extreme challenges. He had opened a window into an entirely new way of understanding life, adaptation, and scientific potential. The scientific mystery had deepened, and its resolution promised to change everything. The news of Jack's extraordinary performance spread across the galactic academic networks with unprecedented speed. Research stations, academic consortiums, and scientific institutions from hundreds of different star systems began to take notice. What had begun as a simple exchange student program was transforming into something far more significant. Professor Krelvak convened an emergency symposium of the most distinguished researchers in the galaxy. Holographic representations filled the conference chamber, beings from 1,000 different worlds, each with their own unique perspective on biological adaptation and scientific understanding. The central display reconstructed Jack's journey. Each survival challenge became a data point, a living demonstration of human potential that challenged everything these researchers thought they understood about biological adaptation. The crystalline researchers from the Crichton systems studied the data with intense concentration. Silicon-based life forms from the Outer Rim analyzed the molecular interactions with growing excitement. "We are witnessing," Professor Krelvak announced, "a fundamental shift in our understanding of biological potential." The symposium became a crucible of scientific discovery. Traditional power structures based on technological superiority began to crumble. Humans were not the most technologically advanced species. They were not the strongest. They were not the most numerous. But they represented something entirely new, a dynamic, adaptive system that could transform challenge into opportunity. Research teams began to compile comprehensive studies of human adaptation. Jack's environmental suit became a focal point of intense scientific investigation. What appeared to be a simple protective layer was actually a complex biological interface system. Microscopic adaptive mechanisms responded to environmental changes with a speed and precision that defied conventional understanding. A researcher from the methane cloud civilizations proposed a radical new theory. Humans were not just another species in the galactic ecosystem. They were a living demonstration of adaptive potential, a biological system that could learn, transform, and integrate with environments that would destroy most known life forms. The symposium debates became increasingly heated. Some researchers saw threat where others saw opportunity. Traditional academic hierarchies began to shift. The concept of survival was being rewritten before their eyes. Jack remained at the center of this scientific storm, almost bemused by the attention. To him, this was not about proving superiority. This was about understanding, about learning, about seeing every challenge as an opportunity for growth. We don't conquer environments, he explained during one of the key presentations. We become part of them. Every challenge is an opportunity to understand, to grow, to adapt. The galactic political landscape began to transform. Species that had been locked in centuries of conflict started to study this new approach. Diplomatic missions began to look different. Where traditional approaches relied on technological superiority or military might, a new model emerged, one based on adaptability, on understanding, on the capacity to integrate. Professor Krelvax nominated Jack for the first Galactic Adaptive Potential Award, a newly created recognition that celebrated species that advanced collective understanding beyond traditional boundaries. The nomination itself was unprecedented. Research stations began to develop new collaborative programs. Human scientists were no longer seen as newcomers to the galactic stage. They were viewed as critical partners in understanding biological adaptation, in exploring the fundamental nature of survival. The symposium concluded with a series of groundbreaking proposals: new academic exchange programs, collaborative research initiatives, a fundamental reimagining of how different species could interact and understand each other. Jack watched the proceedings with a mixture of scientific curiosity and quiet humility. He understood that this was about more than his individual achievements. This was about a fundamental shift in understanding, about seeing challenges as opportunities, about the power of adaptation and learning. As the holographic displays began to fade, one thing became clear. The human had done more than survive extreme challenges. He had opened a window into an entirely new way of understanding life, adaptation, and scientific potential. The systemic transformation had begun, and its implications promised to change everything. The galaxy would never be the same again. The final examination approached with an anticipation that vibrated through the entire academic consortium. What had begun as a simple survival course had transformed into something far more profound, a testament to the potential of biological adaptation and scientific understanding. The examination chamber stood as the ultimate challenge, a comprehensive scenario that combined every previous test into one impossible crucible of survival. Walls constructed from adaptive quantum materials shimmered with potential, ready to generate environmental conditions that would challenge the fundamental understanding of biological existence. Professor Krelvax addressed the assembled students and researchers. His bioluminescent tendrils moved with a combination of scientific excitement and profound respect. "This is more than an examination," he explained. "This is a moment of discovery." Jack stood among his fellow students, but he was distinctly different. Where others saw an impossible challenge, he perceived a complex scientific puzzle waiting to be unraveled. His environmental suit, a marvel of adaptive technology that looked deceptively simple, hummed with potential. The chamber awakened like a living organism. Environmental conditions began to shift with impossible complexity. Chemical structures that would typically dissolve molecular bonds danced in intricate patterns. Gravitational fields warped and twisted, creating zones where fundamental physical laws seemed to bend and reshape themselves. Thermal ranges oscillated between temperatures that would freeze atoms solid and others that would transform matter into plasma states. Most students activated their most advanced protective systems. Warning signals erupted in a cacophony of technological panic. Protective suits from the most advanced galactic civilizations began to show immediate stress indicators. Jack moved differently. His suit became more than a protective layer. It transformed into a dynamic interface with the environment. Microscopic adaptive mechanisms responded to environmental changes with a speed and precision that challenged fundamental understanding of biological engineering. Where other students fought against the impossible conditions, Jack seemed to be in a delicate conversation with the environment itself. Each molecular shift became an opportunity for understanding. Each environmental challenge a chance to learn, to grow, to integrate. The examination reached its critical point. Conditions that should have been impossible to survive became a living laboratory of scientific discovery. Most students were now completely enclosed in their protective systems, reduced to passive observers. Jack continued to move, to collect data, to interact with the environment in ways that redefined the very concept of survival. Professor Krelvax watched with intense scientific curiosity. The human student moved with a grace that defied conventional understanding. Each environmental shift became an opportunity for observation, for learning. When the simulation reached its peak, most students emerged shaken, their protective systems barely functional. Jack stepped forward, his environmental suit showing minimal signs of stress, his eyes bright with the excitement of scientific discovery. The examination had become something else entirely. A window into a fundamentally different approach to survival, to understanding, to science itself. The gathered researchers realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Jack had not just survived the impossible. He had transformed the very concept of biological adaptation. His performance was more than an individual achievement. It was a demonstration of human potential that would reshape scientific understanding across the galaxy. As the examination chamber began to stabilize, the true significance of what had just occurred began to sink in. This was more than a survival test. This was a profound demonstration of the human capacity to understand, to adapt, to grow. The lecture hall buzzed with a mixture of confusion, excitement, and scientific wonder. Jack had done more than complete an examination. He had revealed something fundamental about the nature of biological adaptation. A lesson that would reshape understanding across the galactic scientific community. Professor Krelvax made a final announcement. Jack would be nominated for the most prestigious scientific recognition in the Galactic Consortium. But more importantly, he would become a bridge, a living demonstration of a fundamentally different approach to survival, to science, to existence itself. The story concluded with a profound realization. Humanity's greatest strength was never about technological superiority or physical prowess. It was about the capacity to observe, to understand, to adapt. To see every challenge not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity for growth and discovery. The galaxy would never be the same again.